Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini,
qui facit et terra,
requiem aeternam dona eis Domine, et lux perpetua luce ad eis, requiescant in pace.
Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Let us move on to the Easter Vigil of 1956. So remember, the pre-55 is under Pius V, Pius X, all the saints. The post-55 were the first changes. So Easter Vigil 1956, a Procrustean bed. Is that the right pronunciation? Procrustean bed. The hermeneutic of rupture. Anthony?
Continuity with tradition was exactly what Pius XII's commission did not want, as was made abundantly clear in the 1951 decree, introducing an experimental Easter Vigil service, and also in the 1955 decree, making it, and the whole of the Holy Week reforms, obligatory for the Roman Rite. Both of these decrees, as we shall see below, contain unjustified criticisms of the traditional rites. They are also accompanied by instructions for new rites, in which the emphasis was placed on the active participation of the laity. In 1953, one of the Commission's members, Father Joseph Lowe, referred to the Easter Vigil as, quote, the great liturgical experiment that he, speaking about Pius XII, ordered to be made, end quote. He asked why it must be celebrated, and gave the answer that it was not because it was the custom, but out of a sense of pastoral responsibility. Here we can discern the dim outline of that hermeneutic of discontinuity with tradition, which was being planned, whereby the very forms used from generation to generation were judged to be dispensable. In order to cover up the enormity of the breach which the Commission was about to make in the millennial tradition of the Easter Vigil, Father Lowe resorted to another rationale. Quote, anything new is resented by the creature of habit called man. It may be due to sloth of spirit, or often just a love of ease. As a matter of fact, there is no question in this case of any innovation, but, more exactly, only of a restoration of the ancient original state of things, end quote. By 1955, however, with the decree Maxima Redemptionis, the shape of this most ancient of vigils, which St. Augustine called the mother of all vigils, was reformulated, and some texts were massively curtailed. And new arrangements were invented for the priest to face the people, involving dialogue with them in the vernacular. In spite of Father Lowe's denial, the Easter Vigil was nothing short of a rather spectacular innovation.
Innovation, yes. And we'll see why. We'll see why here. False dawn of the Easter Vigil reform, Gabriel.
Under pressure from the French and German bishops, Pius XII made a new rule that the Church should no longer hold the Easter Vigil in daylight hours, as had been the case since the 7th or 8th centuries, but should revert to the practice of the first Christians, who held it after dark. No convincing reason was given by the Congregation of Rites as to why the nighttime should be deemed the quote-unquote proper hour for the vigil service. In fact, there is no proper hour for a liturgical vigil. The mystery of the Church's liturgy is, in its essence, not bound by the clock. In liturgical terms, a vigil refers to the eve of a feast day and can be celebrated with propriety at any time of the day. However, Maxima Redemptionis arbitrarily insisted that the ceremonies, quote, may not begin before twilight, or certainly not before sunset, end quote. But the timing of the Easter Vigil had never been set by astronomical calculation, as if everything depended on how many degrees the sun is above or below the horizon. Nevertheless, Father Pius Pach, supported by the Austrian Bishops' Liturgical Commission, boasted that they were among those who had prevailed on Pius XII to change the vigil to nighttime. Posing as a heroic defender of enlightened reform, and raising a standard against the, quote, unliturgical spirit and mentality of the last centuries, end quote, which held the Easter Vigil in the morning, he accused the Church of being in error.
This is Father Pius Parsk. He's calling unliturgical spirit and mentality of the last centuries. I mean, what a pigeon. He's spitting on all of the practice of the church as if they didn't know what they were doing. Unliturgical. Saint after saint. Holy bishop after holy, good pope after good pope. And here he comes along and says it's unliturgical spirit and mentality in these last centuries. These pigeons, pride, curiosity, and love of novelty, defines what?
A modernist.
That's them. And Father Pius Park, he has some good books, which were very popular actually in the seminary when I was in. A lot of the seminarians were reading his works on the liturgy. And at the time, I had no clue who he was. But now we know he was a modernist. So, go on. So he says this. He accused the church of being in error. Quote,
"It is a restoration that is in part due to our efforts, for in its various editions, das hat des Edis,
which means...
which means the year of salvation.
Footnote, this was a collection of volumes on the liturgical year written by Pius Park in the 1920s. It was reprinted several times and translated into various languages. So that's the works that were in the seminary in Winona and still are probably in Virginia. And they're useful for, probably some information here or there. Same with Father Jungmann. He has some useful information in his works, but you got to be careful. You got to be careful to dissect the modernist poison from good facts. Go on.
He stood at the door of the Father of Christendom, like the importunate friend in the gospel story, until an answer was finally given. Even the last edition expressed our wish. It is one of the greatest objectives of the liturgical movement to restore to the Catholic world the Easter Vigil service, the mother of all vigils, as St. Augustine called it. The unliturgical spirit and mentality of the last centuries has deprived us of the holiest of all nights. The liturgical spirit of our day will correct this error." End quote.
Okay, well, there it is. With the change of timing for the Easter Vigil to conform to early Christian practices, it seems as if the Church was ordered to return to the catacombs. It is perplexing that the same Pope who had condemned such a retrograde step in the strongest terms as antiquarianism, remember Pius XII condemned antiquarianism in what encyclical? Mediator Dei, 1947, yeah. Only 4 years earlier, could have countenanced this reversal of his own teaching. Quote from Mediator Dei, 1947, paragraph 61, "The liturgy of the early ages is most certainly worthy of all veneration, but ancient usage must not be esteemed more suitable and proper, either in its own right or in its significance for later times and new situations, on the simple ground that it carries the savor and aroma of antiquity. The more recent liturgical rites likewise deserve reverence and respect. They too owe their inspiration to the Holy Ghost, who assists the Church in every age, even to the consummation of the world. They are equally the resources used by the majestic spouse of Jesus Christ to promote and procure the sanctity of man." Close quote. But the point about his 1955 decree, Maxima Redemptionis, was that it did state that the early Christian Easter Vigil was, quote, more suitable and proper than what had developed over the intervening centuries. And it did reject the principle that the more recent liturgical rites likewise deserve reverence and respect. There is no mistaking the language used in the decree to denigrate the liturgical tradition as it had developed up to the 1950s, Maxima Redemptionis, carried a note of reprobation of what had been approved and maintained as Catholic practice for centuries, with the scarcely veiled implication that the Church for most of its history had conducted its worship on the wrong lines. In it, the accusation was made that the Easter Vigil had lost its original clarity and the meaning of its words and symbols when it was torn from its proper nocturnal setting and was no longer in line with the Gospel accounts. According to the reformers, it had even become harmful, quote unquote, to the symbolic meaning of the vigil. Quote from Maxima Redemptionis, quote, the expression avulsa, snatched away, is offensive and unwarranted, as it has a particularly violent connotation in Latin, being associated with the acts of robbery, abduction, etc. Anyone would think they were referring to a monstrous iniquity that must be removed from the church. In other words, the Holy See, echoing the reformers, was claiming that the public prayers of the church, celebrated continually for many centuries, sanctified by long usage and codified by the
Councils of Trent.
were theologically defective and liturgically improper. Is it conceivable that the traditional manner of celebrating the Easter Vigil in the daytime was a disastrous mistake, and that the church had to wait 14 centuries for Bonini and his henchmen to put the matter right? It's well said. So Bonini saved the day, right? Bonini came along and saved the day from the errors of Pius V and Pius X and all the saints and all the holy bishops, monks, abbots. Wow, Bonini. I'm surprised he's not canonized by the new church. He's their hero. They should have t-shirts of Bonini and Paul VI on the front and Bonini on the back.
If I may, I doubt they would even want anybody to know about Bonini, because most Novus Ordo Catholics, they don't even know what tradition is. And then if they look up this guy and they see how they changed the mass, what's it? They probably don't even want anybody looking into
That
it.
is true, because if they were to like canonize him or make him a big figure, people will want to know about him.
What
They
did
get
he
into
do?
his diary,
Yeah.
into his journal. Then they're going to read in his own journal that he admits that we changed everything.
That's right. They'll find he's actually a barbarian. Barbarian is actually a good term. I mean, the barbarians were great men compared to these guys. At least they were men, but these are weasels. They're not even worth being called barbarians.
They're like the eunuchs that we hear about in the history books.
Yes. I mean, when you weigh how many souls have gone to hell and how many souls have lost the faith, the destruction of marriages, families, children that should be here, the destruction of vocations at every level, it's not an exaggeration to say Bonini, people get offended if you call him a weasel or call him a pigeon or whatever, but look how many souls this guy has taken to hell. Seriously, just put that in the scale of words. Calling him a pigeon is nice. Anyway, it took 14 centuries for Bonini and his henchmen to put the matter right, after the church has made a big mistake about the Easter Vigil. Of course not, and it remains for us to examine in detail the Easter Vigil changes which were published in the 1951 and 55 decrees. Although Holy Saturday is the last day of the Sacred Triduum, it was the first target of the Reformers' aim to change the entire Holy Week liturgy. 1951 marks the occasion of the first experimental changes to the Easter Vigil service. Initially, they pretended that it was only a question of changing the time of the ceremony from morning to night. Footnote, the three aforementioned expert consultors of the commission were all in favor of holding the vigil at night, with Capel being the most adamant about it. But we now know for certain that what was being planned by Bonini and the Liturgical Commission in 1948 was far more disruptive of tradition and takes us onto quite a different plane. So you see, the average Catholic in 1951, they thought, okay, the Pope approved a night vigil. It's going to be the exact same ceremonies, but at night. That's what they thought. But, soundtrack, Bonini steps in. Bonini, poor soul. And Pius XII didn't catch the snake that was right under his nose because he didn't have the grace to see it, because he didn't do what?
Oh, it's Great Russia to the Immaculate Heart.
I'm convinced of that. Just think if Pius XI and Pius XII did do the consecration. Right now we'd be in the age of Mary. There would be no communism. There would be no Vatican II, no new Mass. Seminaries would be packed full, large families. The economy would be Catholic, run by Catholic virtue. Political leaders would be consecrating the countries to the Sacred Heart. The flag would have the Sacred Heart put on it, flying off the White House. There'd be a huge renovation on the Statue of Liberty to turn her into the real Mother of Liberty, the Mother of God, holding the child Jesus, holding high the torch of the Catholic faith, or the cross in her hand, right? This would be the age of Mary. Abortion would not have been passed. Do you realize that? That means billions of people would be on the earth who should be here and have been killed. It should be the age of Mary, but these popes didn't do it. So, all right, Father, don't blame always on all the popes all the time. Well, it's true. We get the leaders we deserve. We had a pope who was weak and didn't do it because maybe the faithful didn't also listen to Our Lady either, praying the rosary every day, 5 First Saturday devotion, etc., etc. So it kind of goes both ways. All right. The 1948 Papal Commission was primed by key members of the liturgical movement to reform the Easter Vigil in response to demands by the reformist German bishops, known to be quite liberal always, among whom the last vestiges of liturgical order, discipline, and loyalty to Rome had broken down. As we have seen, they had set up an autonomous Episcopal Conference for liturgical matters in what year?
1940.
Independently of Rome. So they were doing their own thing back in the 1940s. And they were known to be avant-garde. They were known to be progressive, like they were practicing new Mass in the 40s, facing the people, table, all that. The German bishops, the Rhine bishops, that's Netherlands, Holland. As you saw that 1965 little video, they were already progressive. Independently of Rome, the aim of which was to wrest control of the liturgy from the Holy See. While promoting the dissident activities of avant-garde or progressive liturgists in their own diocese, the German bishops were strongly supported by their compatriot and frontman in the Vatican, Father Augustin Bea, the famous Bea, another Mason who met with the Masons in New York City, right? Drinking wine and cheese with these high-up Freemasons. Father Augustin Bea, who was a permanent member of Pius XII's Commission on the Liturgy. Next, the formation of a protection monopoly over the liturgy. Michael?
The history of the liturgical movement shows that since 1940, the Pope was under siege by the German and French reformist movements, who were rallying their combined forces to wrest control of the liturgy from Rome. On the 2nd of November 1950, the bishops of Germany and Austria, in conjunction with France, formally petitioned Pope Pius XII to move the Easter Vigil to the nighttime. This request had been proposed by Father Romano Guardini at the First German National Liturgical Congress, organized by the Liturgical Institute of Thiers in Frankfurt in June of that year. As we have already noted, there was no real justification for this change. This point is worth emphasizing, for it indicates that said bishops were offering a service to fix a problem that did not exist. Furthermore, they were determined to eliminate any competition from traditionalists, which would undermine their monopoly over the direction of liturgical reform. This is evident from a letter published as Ein Wort zur liturgische Frage, a word on the liturgical question, which Guardini wrote in 1940 to the Bishop Stohr of Mainz, head of the Liturgical Commission, appointed by the German Episcopal Conference. In it, he demanded that the German bishops should protect the members of the liturgical movement from attacks coming from conservative clergy against their convictions and work. Gardini, however, could hardly be described as a courageous reformer. As long as he was hiding behind the skirts of the German bishops, his agenda can be seen as both craven and partisan. Incidentally, so great was Gardini's popularity among the benign peasants of the liturgical
pensant, the good thoughts. So great was Gardini's popularity among the good thoughts of the liturgical establishment, or well-wishing, yeah.
That even Pius XII protected him and made him a prelate of the papal household in 1952.
Okay, craven. As an adjective, craven describes someone who is contemptibly cowardly, faint-hearted, or lacking the slightest bit of courage. So, the author here is using that word for his. As long as he was hiding behind the skirts of the German bishops, his, Guardini, agenda can be seen as both craven and partisan. So, it was a weaselish, in other words. An exercise in saber rattling. Anthony, can you shut that window, please?
An interesting feature of this organized campaign was its ability to secure the patronage of Pius XII, who, as we have seen, was willing to conciliate their demands. It is not surprising that in 1950 the German bishops, mafia style, made the Pope an offer he couldn't refuse: protect the desires of the liturgical movement, or face an out-and-out mutiny of the combined French and German episcopates. To this Franco-German initiative, we may add the implicit threat made by Padrino Antonelli, who wrote in the introduction of the Memoria for the Pope's attention, quote, "It is recognized by all that there exists today throughout the whole Catholic world, and especially in the ranks of the clergy, the desire, or rather the conviction, of the necessity of a reform of the liturgy," end quote. The idea that everyone in the church was clamoring for a reform of the liturgy was, of course, a complete fabrication. There was not the slightest evidence of a worldwide consensus of priests supposedly massing on the horizon and calling for revolutionary changes in the liturgy. But liturgical revolution was precisely what the Commission had the potential to bring about. It could and did put pressure on Pius XII to abolish or alter liturgical legislation, or pass innovatory laws at a stroke of a pen.
Yes. A Procrustean reform. Gabriel, loud and clear.
Whereas the other ceremonies of Holy Week were only partially affected by cuts and innovations, the Easter Vigil, as we shall see, was totally dismembered, its remaining parts arbitrarily rearranged and altered to change its symbolic meaning from a Christ-centered to a man-centered celebration. To illustrate the point by way of analogy, let us recall the story from Greek mythology about Procrustes, a rogue innkeeper and robber from Attica, who had a bed that he claimed would fit anyone, no matter how tall or short they were. And he was right. He forced his guests to fit the size of the bed by cutting off their legs or stretching their bodies into the required shape before robbing them of their valuables. The analogy can be aptly applied to the new Easter Vigil, which Pius XII presented to the Church as a fait
accompli, as an accomplished fact.
In 1956, when it became obvious that the entire rite had been hacked and racked on a Procrustean bed of reform, with many of its precious assets stolen. Assets stolen. The reformers chose active participation as the bed on which the traditional rite was to be measured, and decided that whatever parts of it did not conform to their ideals should be hacked off or skewed beyond recognition.
So what does the author here mean by a Procrustean reform? using the analogy of the Greek myth Procrustes. What did Procrustes do?
He delimbed his victims in order for them to fit on the bed, or he stretched them out.
Yes, so that's a funny analogy, but it's actually true. The Easter Vigil put on the dock. Now we will examine the 1948 Memoria to see what in that text was used to justify the creation of a new rite. Chapter 3 reveals the fundamental bias of the Commission against the traditional Easter liturgy, vigil, how it was put on trial and accused under false pretenses of being unfit for purpose. Father Antonelli mentioned some quote-unquote problems with the traditional Easter vigil as a whole, which he considered stood in need of reform. To begin with, he considered the centuries-old tradition of holding the vigil in the morning as an aberration from the practice of the early Christians who held it at night and recommended a return to antiquity. There were also, in his opinion, too many Old Testament readings and not enough emphasis on baptism or scope for active participation by the laity. So the remedy was to be sought in swinging, reduction of the number of scriptural passages, or diminishing them. These were reduced from 12 readings to 4, increased levels of activity by the laity, and the introduction of a complete liturgical novelty, which was the
Renewal of baptismal promises by the congregation.
Yes, now that the Lenten penance is over, we celebrate the Easter Vigil and and now let's pray we first do the baptismal vow. Do you renounce Satan? We do renounce him. And all of his works? We do renounce them. Now let's say together the Our Father. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Never heard of in history, saying the vernacular in the middle of a Tridentine ceremony. First time. And you know what's in Bonini's mind. This negative stereotypes, Michael.
But all these points, far from constituting evidence for a reform, simply reflected the views which were characteristic of the leaders of the liturgical movement. As we have seen, these views had already been doing the rounds in the German-speaking lands in the 1930s and 40s, when some progressivists, such as Father Pius Park, Romano Gardini, and Hans Reinhold, were conducting their own experiments with the Easter Vigil in defiance of canon law. There is reason to believe that what Father Antonelli wrote in the Memoria about the presumed need to reform the Easter Vigil was merely the expression of his own personal opinions, coupled with those of other activists for liturgical reform. The fine details of this reform were left to be hammered out by a subcommission in secret and later approved by Pius XII.
A courageous innovation, Anthony.
One of the reforms that Antonelli had in mind, which is actually what transpired, was the insertion of a new rite into the Easter Vigil, which would allow the congregation to renew their baptismal promises in dialogue with the priest. He stated in the Memoria, quote, "It is a question of finding courageous men with a good knowledge of the ancient liturgy, capable of creating today a rite, a ceremony, in the sense of the primitive liturgy, and in the spirit of modern life. That is one of the points that many people hope for from this long-desired liturgical reform," end quote.
Brother, can you ask Brother to start in the back?
Before proceeding further, we must note that the quote-unquote many people were the few key reformers, mainly from Germany and France, supported by a band of zealous flag wavers, and that there was certainly no popular demand among the clergy or laity for a reform of the Easter Vigil. Earlier in the Memoria, he stated that, quote, "The Church knows how to make courageous innovations when the supreme good of Christian life demands it," end quote. In fact, Father Antonelli once boasted of his self-styled courage to Pius XII during an audience when he presented his Memoria to the Pope. In his diary, dated July 22, 1949, he said that the Pope, having read some of the Memoria, described the proposals for the reform as valientes, meaning courageous. And Antonelli replied that his courage was based on his confidence that he could count on the Pope's support. As it turned out, his confidence was rewarded by Pius XII in the Holy Week reform. Thus, he introduced two concepts which were foreign to the Church's discipline: that innovation was a praiseworthy and integral part of the liturgical development, and that new rites which had no precedent in liturgical history can be invented if deemed by quote-unquote courageous men, including himself, to be good for the people. From that moment, the official organs of the Holy See embarked on a course of liturgical adventurism that would lead eventually to the most incongruous innovation of all, Pope Paul's new Mass. It is in light of the Memoria, then, that we can interpret the thinking behind Article 23 of the Constitution on the Liturgy, which says that, quote,
This is Vatican II you're quoting. Go ahead.
There must be no innovations unless the good of the Church genuinely and certainly requires them, end quote. And that, quote, any new forms adopted should in some way grow organically from forms already existing, end quote. But it was only in the estimation of the reformers that their innovations were considered good. And the new forms envisaged by them came not from forms already existing in tradition, but from those conceived and enacted by the reformers outside tradition, which had no right to existence in the first place. Unfortunately, Pius XII incorporated some of these into the Church's official liturgy.
Yes. So why did Pius XII allow all this? Well, maybe his health wasn't great in the last 5 years. And who knows, but I think the bottom line is he lost the grace because he didn't,
Consecrate Russia as Immaculate Heart.
which was demanded from heaven. It still is. It's still not been done.
And Father.
Yeah.
Just that one, well, there's two sentences there from Vatican II, but even the first one that I read, that's ambiguous. Like, what does that mean? It says there must be no innovations unless the good of the Church genuinely and certainly requires them. That could mean anything. Anybody that could fall, they could just say that, oh, this is for the good of the Church.
Yes, that's right. Bongo drums at Mass Sunday. Go to the church. We have a majority of Nigerians in the parish. Our mariachi Mass this Sunday. We've got some Mexicans in the parish, so it's for the good of the church. Yeah, it's this reads like a novel of a nightmare, something that you can't believe what happened, but it's happened. And right under the nose of a good pope. He was a good pope, but he didn't catch these snakes. They knew what they were up to, but he doesn't seem to have realized just how deep these wicked innovations were heading towards, how deeply wrong. And I think he lost the grace to see it because he didn't obey the Mother of God. He was called the Pope of Fatima. And in the beginning of his pontificate, he was all about Fatima. And then he took a change in his last years. He wasn't so gung-ho about Fatima anymore. I think Father Danis got to him. Father Dhanis. He was another little weaselly devil in the Vatican who was all against Fatima, Father Danis. He always attacked Fatima, attacked Sister Lucia. He didn't believe in Fatima. He tried everything to tear it down. So he's met his fate. He's already died and is judged. And it's not a happy judgment for anyone who goes against the Most Blessed Virgin Mary. They're going to lose. An Orwellian moment, Gabriel, loud and clear.
Suddenly, the destroyers of tradition, who had been ignoring or deliberately
Flouting
the rubrics and rebelling against authority, were transformed into heroes of the Church.
Explain that sentence, anybody? What's really going on here?
The rebellious bishops who were originally going against the orders of the previous popes to do the Mass in the vernacular, change the Holy Week, now their ideas and their position was being promoted by the Pope.
Yeah, now they're heroes. They were always, before they were like snakes in the dark, going against the orders of the Church, canon law, the mind of the Holy See. And now suddenly these snakes are championed as great heroes, paraded through the streets, so to speak. Okay, loud and clear, please.
Received forms of worship which had been the mainstay of the spiritual life of the faithful for centuries, and were instrumental in the formation of countless saints, were deemed useless and cast aside by the quote-unquote courageous actions of the reformers.
Okay, we'll pick up next time. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.